So I'm picking up here where I left off before. We're going to move a little bit quicker. This thing's going to get a little bit more advanced, but not too much, so I wouldn't worry about it. So what we're going to look at is opacity in this video. That's kind of what we're going to focus on, being able to see through things. So if I look over here, I've got an opacity input, but it's grayed out. I can't use it. There's a whole bunch I can use, but I can't use those. So how in the world do I unlock those features? Well, if you come over here to the details panel and just make sure that you don't have anything selected, or you select the material node, that way you can get the correct material node details over here so that you can go ahead and edit them. So let's go over here and you'll see that we have some material parameters here. I'm going to go to the blend mode. I'm going to change the default opaque mode to a translucent mode. And we have a few options here, but I'm going to pick translucent because that's going to allow us to do objects that you can see through. Okay, they can have transparency. Now when I switch it, you notice that the opacity input is now finally available for us to use. So if I come over here and look at this object, it's going to look like this. It almost looks a little bit self-illuminating, but we can't see through it. There's no transparency yet because we haven't defined the opacity yet on the material. So the way that we can do that is either through like constant vectors, like a one vector, something like that. We can also use textures. And I have some nodes here that I set up earlier just to go a little bit faster. And whoops, looks like I grabbed onto the wrong nodes here, or one wrong node, or a couple. So I'll just untangle that mess real quick. Okay, so here I have my opacity stuff. And it's pretty straightforward. All it is a texture that's going to be multiplied by a one vector, and that's going to feed into the opacity input of the material, which is pretty straightforward. So I'm going to get rid of that comment box. It was just kind of getting in the way in this tutorial. So I've got a texture coordinate node plugged into my texture is plugged into a multiply node, and that's being multiplied by one vector, which is set at 0.25. So the way transparency works is like this. Let me just show you here. I'm going to plug this texture into the opacity slot. You're going to see in the preview window what happened, but let's jump into the viewport here. Oh, and whoa, what in the world happened here? Some parts of the object have just completely disappeared, while some parts are completely opaque and we can't see through them. Basically, the white checkers on this checkerboard material are opaque. We can't see through them. They're opaque. It's like trying to see through a solid wall. But the black checkers are completely invisible. So why in the world did that happen? Well, if I look at the texture being used here, it's black and white. And the way that transparency works in Unreal, as well as most other game engines, is anything that's white is not going to be see-through. Anything that's black can be seen through by the player camera. Okay, so black is invisible, white is visible. White is opaque, black is translucent. Okay, any shades of gray in between black and white are going to make different shades of transparency. Alright, and I could show you that next with a very simple and basic example. I'm going to create a multiply node and plug in my texture to that, and then I'm going to go ahead and plug in a constant one vector, which is just a number, into the multiply, and I'm going to plug the multiply into the opacity. So basically we're going to multiply this checkerboard texture by number. Right now it's set to 0, and if I jump back into the viewport, well, looks like our sphere disappeared. What happened? Did it get deleted? No, it's still there. What's happening is I'm multiplying all of the colors in the texture by 0. And if you remember math from when you were in school, anything multiplied by 0 is 0. In the world of colors, 0 is black, 1 is white. So if the entire value of our texture is being turned into 0, that's why we get nothing. We're completely invisible. So if I set it back, we'll get the white checkers that we can't see through, and then the black checkers we can see through, as you can see in my example. So if I set that to 1, anything multiplied by 1 is going to be itself. So the white parts of the texture have value of 1, 1 multiplied by 1 is 1, and that's why the white areas are visible. And the whole thing doesn't become invisible like before. So it's a pretty straightforward idea. So what happens if I set this instead of 0 or 1? What happens if I use 0.5? Well, let's see. If we jump back into Unreal, we'll be able to see that the black checkers are still invisible, but now the white checkers, guess what? We can still see through them. Or now we can see through them. Before we couldn't see through them, now they're sort of semi-transparent, almost like looking through a tinted window. Okay, so we can see the shadow behind the object here, and the reason that's happening again is because we're multiplying 0.5 by the texture. So now white multiplied by 0.5 equals 0.5. If you go ahead and multiply 1 times 0.5, you're going to get 0.5. So what we're doing is we're cutting the white in half and making it gray, a medium gray, which is 0.5. And when something is a medium gray, you're going to be able to see it a little bit. Okay? So if something's kind of gray, then you'll be able to see kind of through something. If something is white, you won't be able to see through it. If something's black, you will be able to see through it. In fact, it'll appear as if though the object's not even there at all and it's completely invisible. So that's pretty important to understand how the different shades of black and white and gray are going to affect the opacity of the object. And this is great because you can use textures to control this. Do like tinted windows on a race car in a racing game, for example. Okay? So the next part here is opacity mask, and right now it's grayed out. So how in the world do we get access to the opacity mask? Well, that's pretty easy. I'm going to make sure that I go back here to the material settings. I'm going to change from translucent to blend mode. I'm going to change it to masked. And now we can see that opacity is grayed out, but opacity mask is available for us to use. So I'm going to look at this object, and it looks just like before, except now it's shiny, it's got reflections, specularity, roughness, all that good stuff. All that stuff went away before. I don't know if you noticed, but it actually went away because opacity shaders don't support that. But a shader with that's set to masked does support that. Okay? But it works a little bit different than the translucent shader. And we'll get to see that in a moment. So what I'm going to do is for my content browser, I'm going to pull in some textures and stuff over here. So I'm going to pull in a normal map and a texture. And if I look at my texture here, it's basically a chain link fence. And if I look at the alpha, it has an alpha channel. Okay? Now, alphas are outside the scope of this tutorial, so I'm not going to go over how to create alphas and say something like Photoshop. But there's lots of information out there about alphas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this texture into the base color, and then down here below the red, green, and blue pins is a little gray pin. That's the alpha pin. I'm going to take the alpha pin and plug it into the opacity mask parameter. And what that's going to give me, if I switch over to a little polyplane preview, I'm going to have basically a fence, a chain link fence. I'm going to take the normal map and I'm going to plug that into the normal of the object. And that's going to make the fence look a little bit more realistic and make it pop out. But let me take this texture coordinate node, which is already set to a U and a V tiling of 4. I'm going to plug that into both of those, the diffuse texture and the normal map. So now this starts to look more like a fence. If I come back over here, you can see what I have. Basically, the actual chain itself, the metal parts of the chain link fence, are opaque and they're completely visible. But the sections in between, the gaps in between the chain link fence are invisible, and that's thanks to that alpha map, which is doing that for me. Now I'm going to turn this into a two-sided material by checking on a two-sided flag, make the changes, and come back in here. This will allow us to render out the back side. And now we can see the front and the back being rendered at the same time. Again, that's a little bit more expensive to render, but it's okay. It's not going to make the game crash or anything like that. But it is off by default. So by turning it on, I get this sort of object. It starts to kind of look like a fishnet, actually. So in video games, if you were to make a fence like this, you don't model out every single little piece of metal wire mesh that would be extremely expensive to create and render and all that stuff. What you would create is a polyplane and then apply texture like this with an opacity mask. So using a shader with opacity mask is extremely good for doing stuff like this. It's great for like nets, fences, gates, anything basically that needs to have some kind of gaps in between geometry, but that would be way too expensive to model out or sculpt in a 3D package. Alright, so that takes care of opacity mask. I'm going to go ahead and reapply my normal map as well as my texture to the base color and all that good stuff, and try to get my material back to how it was before. Okay, cool. So I'm going to end this video here. There's still a lot more to cover in inputs for materials in Unreal 4. I'll see you in the next video. We'll continue talking about materials.